I had never intended to set foot in his house, and yet that day changed everything. It began with the simplest of actions, a gesture born of concern. My husband was away on a business trip, leaving me to spend another quiet, lonely day at home. That morning, I busied myself with cleaning and scrolled aimlessly through social media, trying to push away the growing sense of monotony in my life. Around noon, I heard it, a strange sound coming from my neighbor's house. At first, I dismissed it as a distant sound, perhaps the old plumbing acting up, but it didn't stop. It got louder and louder, becoming a steady rush of water. My stomach nodded in concern. Mr. Harrison, my neighbor, was a kind man, a figure of quiet dignity who had lived alone since the death of his wife. Although we weren't particularly close, I had always admired his calm demeanor and the way he carried himself, even after such a profound loss. He seemed strong and resilient, but the thought of him alone in that house made me uneasy. What if he'd fallen? What if he needed help? As I glanced out the window, I noticed something that only added to my concern. His front door was slightly ajar. My heart raced. This wasn't like him. Mr. Harrison was meticulous, the kind of person who always double-checked. Something had to be wrong. I hurried over and stood at his door, my nerves tinging with hesitation. I knocked quietly at first. "Mr. Harrison, are you all right?" My voice carried into the silence of his house, but there was no answer. The sound of rushing water inside only grew louder, adding to my anxiety. I paused, torn between respecting his privacy and the nagging fear that he might be in trouble. What if he had collapsed and couldn't call for help? My mind painted the worst possible scenarios. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open a little wider and stepped inside. The living room was spotless, just as I'd expected. Everything was in its place, and the faint, familiar scent of aftershave hung in the air. But the sound of water continued, drawing me towards the hallway. "Mr. Harrison," I called again, my voice a little louder this time. The door to the bathroom was slightly ajar, and steam wafted into the hallway. My breath quickened. The scene felt surreal. My own heartbeat was loud in my ears as I approached the door, and then I saw him. Through the misty glass of the bathroom mirror, I caught a glimpse of Mr. Harrison under the shower, his back to me, water cascading over his broad shoulders. I froze, realizing with horror that I'd intruded on something deeply personal. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. He turned slightly, just enough to see me in the doorway. His eyes widened in surprise, but his expression wasn't what I'd expected. It wasn't anger or embarrassment. It was calm, composed. I fumbled for words, my face burning with humiliation. "I'm so sorry," I stammered quickly, looking away. "I thought something was wrong. I heard the water." My voice trailed off as my hands instinctively grabbed a towel and held it out to him. He surprised me with a deep, warm chuckle. "It's all right," he said, his voice soothing. "I should have locked the door. You were just being thoughtful." His reaction disarmed me completely. I had braced myself for irritation, even anger, but there was none. Instead, he stepped out of the shower, wrapping the towel around his waist with an ease that made me feel even more flustered. Water dripped from his silver-streaked hair, and yet he stood there as if this kind of interruption was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "I'll go now," I muttered, backing away towards the door. I didn't mean to interrupt. As I turned to leave, his voice stopped me. "Wait." His tone was softer now, almost hesitant. "Thanks for checking up on me. It's nice to know someone cares." Those words stayed with me long after I returned home. I told myself it was nothing, just a moment of neighborly concern, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. Something had changed. In the days that followed, I avoided him, not out of anger, but because I was too embarrassed to face him. But no matter how hard I tried to put the encounter out of my mind, it lingered. It wasn't just his appearance, though, that had certainly made an impression. It was the way he had handled the situation, with kindness, with grace. He hadn't laughed at my awkwardness or scolded me for barging in. Instead, he thanked me. A few days later, as I was trimming the bushes in my garden, his voice startled me. "Looks like you've got your hands full," he said, casually leaning against the fence that separated our yards. My first instinct was to stammer out an excuse and retreat, but his warm smile disarmed me once again. "It's more of a battle than a skill," I replied, attempting a light laugh. He chuckled, the sound as familiar and comforting as ever. "If you ever need any help, just let me know," he said, his tone friendly and sincere. At that moment, I felt the weight of my embarrassment begin to lift. There was something about Mr. Harrison, something steady, something grounding. I didn't fully understand it at the time, but I knew that my life had been knocked off its familiar course, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find my way back. "You do it better than I ever could. My wife had a knack for these things," Mr. Harrison's voice softened, his expression changing as a flicker of sadness crossed his face. "I let a lot go. Most of their plants didn't survive. They needed your care." His words took me by surprise, causing me to pause mid-question, unsure of what to say. Without thinking, I blurted it out. "I could help if you'd like." The offer came out of my mouth before I even realized what I was saying. That's how it started. Over the next few days, it became a routine. I'd spend an hour or two in Mr. Harrison's garden, helping him trim overgrown bushes and revive neglected flower beds. He'd work alongside me, telling me stories about his late wife, his decades as a teacher, and the journeys he'd always dreamed of but never taken. His voice was like a soothing melody, steady, warm, and reassuring. At first it was simple, innocent, two neighbours finding companionship in shared tasks. But as the days stretched into weeks, I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way his gaze lingered a little too long, the softness in his eyes when he spoke to me, and when our hands brushed against each other as we worked, the electric jolt that went through me was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as we stood side by side admiring the freshly tidied garden, he handed me a glass of lemonade. Our fingers touched briefly, and the air between us seemed to shift. I felt my breath catch, but neither of us moved. "You've done more for this place than I have in years," he said quietly, his eyes locked with mine. "It's nothing," I replied, my voice lower than I had intended. "It's not nothing," he murmured. There was something in his tone, something raw and unspoken that made me shiver. I looked away, laughing nervously. "Maybe you just needed some help." "Or maybe," he said, his voice steady and his gaze unwavering, "I just needed someone to remind me how much life still has to offer." I didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to withdraw, to remind myself that I was a married woman, and this was simply an act of neighbourly kindness. But another part of me couldn't deny the attraction I felt for him, the spark that was undeniably there. That night changed everything. The rain was soft, pattering gently against the windows. My husband had called earlier to tell me that his business trip was going to be extended for another week. I reassured him on the phone that I understood, but deep down I felt a nagging sense of loneliness. I hadn't planned to. Mr. Harrison's house that night. I'd baked cookies earlier to distract myself from the emptiness of the evening, and before I knew it, I was standing at his door, a plate of cookies in my hands. When he opened the door, his smile was warm and his eyes lit up with surprise. "What's this?" he asked, pointing to the biscuits. "I thought you might like something sweet," I said, feeling awkward and foolish. I expected him to say no, but instead he stepped aside and invited me in. We ended up in his cozy living room, the fire crackling softly in contrast to the cold outside. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did, touching on everything and nothing. But tonight felt different. There was a quiet intimacy in the air, something unspoken but undeniably present. As I reached for my glass on the coffee table, it tilted slightly, and Mr. Harrison instinctively caught it before it spilled. Our hands collided, and instead of pulling away, we both froze. I looked up to find him staring at me, his gaze searching and uncertain. "You don't have to stay if you're uncomfortable," he said quietly, his voice steady but hesitant. "I'm not uncomfortable," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He leaned in slightly, testing the fragile space between us. I didn't move, and then the distance disappeared. His lips brushed against mine, tentatively at first, as if to give me the chance to pull away, but I didn't. The kiss deepened, and in that moment, months of unspoken longing poured out. I knew it was wrong. This shouldn't be happening. Every fibre of my being screamed, but as his hand cupped my face and my fingers found their way to his, the weight of my loneliness melted away. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt seen, wanted, and that feeling, however fleeting or forbidden, was impossible to resist. Nothing else seemed to matter, just the way his hands held me and the way his touch made me feel seen, wanted, and alive. The rain outside intensified, but inside the world felt still. The only sounds were our breathing and the faint crackling of the fire. At one point he paused, his gaze searching mine as if to give me the chance to say no. But I didn't. When it was over, we sat in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. He took my hand and held it gently, his thumb brushing softly against my skin. "I never meant to complicate your life," he said softly, his voice tinged with regret. I didn't know what to say. My mind was a tumultuous mix of guilt, desire, fear, and exhilaration. I should have felt ashamed, and part of me did, but another part, a deeper part I didn't want to acknowledge, felt liberated, as if I had finally broken free from some invisible cage I hadn't realized was holding me. I stayed that night longer than I should have. When the rain stopped, I finally made my way home, my heart heavy and my mind racing with questions. What had I done, and why, in spite of everything, did I want to do it again? The days that followed were a blur of guilt and longing. Every glance at my husband was a painful reminder of the betrayal. Every quiet moment replayed that night in vivid detail. I told myself it was a mistake that would never happen again, but the pain in my chest told me otherwise. At first, Mr. Harrison and I avoided each other. It was as if pretending nothing had happened would make it go away, but the silence between us soon became unbearable. One evening, I found myself standing by the fence that separated our farms. He was already there, waiting, as if he'd known I was coming. "I've been thinking about us," he began, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. His eyes met mine. "I never wanted to hurt you or disrupt your life." "Neither did I whispered, my voice faltering. The truth was, I didn't even know what I wanted. He sighed and leaned against the fence. "I spent so many years alone, telling myself I didn't need anyone, and then you came along?" He trailed off, shaking his head as if struggling to find the right words. I never expected this. Tears welled up in my eyes. "It's not you, it's me. I let this happen. I should have—" "No," he interrupted gently. "We're both responsible, but it's not fair to you or to him." His words should have been a relief, and yet they only deepened the pain in my chest. "So what do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He paused, then reached out, his fingers brushing over mine. "We move on, we let it go, we pretend it never happened." But pretending was much, much easier said than done. The tension between us wouldn't go away, even if we tried to keep our distance. Every shared glance, every fleeting encounter felt like a reopened wound. My husband remained oblivious to the storm raging inside me. He went on with his routine, and yet I felt more alone than ever. One evening he asked me why I seemed so distant. His question took me by surprise. For a moment I considered telling him everything, unburdening myself of the truth, but fear held me back, fear of losing everything. So I lied. "I'm just tired," I said. He accepted my answer without hesitation, but the weight of the lie remained with me long after the words had left my mouth. True to his word, Mr. Harrison began to walk away. He stopped waiting by the fence and stopped inviting me over. His absence hurt more than I expected, but I told myself it was for the best. I threw myself into rebuilding my marriage, trying to repair what I had allowed to fall apart. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of him in his garden. Each time my heart ached at the memory of what we'd shared. Months passed and life slowly returned to a semblance of normality. But the memory of that night never really left me. It lingered in the quiet moments, the spaces between thoughts. I often wondered if he felt the same. Did he still think of me as I thought of him? In the end, there was no neat resolution, no closure, just the quiet acceptance that some choices leave scars and some connections, however fleeting, change your life forever.